Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. In an article titled Ghosts Whom We Have Met, which appeared in an 1885 issue of Home Chimes, F. Bayford Harrison complains that most reports of ghosts, quote, come at second or third hand. And he talks about how it's difficult to find a report that is given by the person who actually saw the ghost, a first-hand ghost report. In my searching for ghost reports published during the Victorian period, I did pretty well at finding some very interesting stories that are told by the person who was there. Harrison didn't have as much luck, and the first stories that he shares, by his own admission, were kind of disappointing. However, he ends his article by telling his readers that he has, quote, a reward for their patience. It's a report that was sent to him by a woman that he identifies only as CF. That was very common during the Victorian period, to obscure the identity of people by just using their initials. It's kind of their version of pixelating a face. Let me read you this report given by CF. More than 20 years ago, I became acquainted with GM, a youth of amiable disposition and many excellent qualities, who had but just completed his university education, and for whom his father, a wealthy London merchant, had purchased a share in a shipbroking business in the port of C. My husband, at that time occupying a counselor post at C, had met this young fellow at his club, where the local magnates frequently assembled to play whist and pool. My husband had taken a great fancy to GM and brought him up to our house, where he became a frequent visitor. His fondness for music, literature, and athletic sports, to all of which my husband was ardently addicted, led to a close friendship and intimacy between the two. Furthermore, GM was an excellent cricketer, horseman, jumper, and runner, as well as an accomplished classical scholar. For several months, until indeed the failure of his partner swept away the capital with which his father had started him in life and compelled him to seek his fortune in lands beyond the sea, we saw a great deal of GM, and he became an element in our home life. He accompanied us in country walks, played billiards with my husband, and joined the cricket club of which the latter was captain, read the books we read, took part in all our amusements. He was indeed quite l'enfant de la maison. We ourselves were young people, barely a year married, and took great delight in the society of one so near our own age, who, moreover, was of a singularly amiable disposition, gay, full of quaint humor and frank fun, and also sincerely attached to us both. Love begets love, and we were very fond of GM. When he was sent off to South Africa by his father on a second life venture, we could not have been more grieved or forlorn had we lost a brother. In common with a distant cousin, he became the proprietor of a large tract of land in Natal, where he tried the experiment of scientific farming. Undiscouraged by mishap after mishap, he stuck to his enterprise for 6 years, during which time his youngest brother had joined him, and we had 3 or 4 letters a year from him narrating some of his strange experiences and adventures. In all his letters he spoke hopefully of our meeting when his term of 7 years should have elapsed. In the summer of 1867, my husband being at that time absent on a special mission, I was staying with some very dear friends at Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. The imperial general there located had organized a banquet. I, being a guest of the British diplomatic agent, the doyen of that corps, was included in the invitation and attended the banquet, which was a splendid but somewhat noisy entertainment. I was seated between the Austrian and Italian diplomatic agents. Shortly after we had taken our places, I felt a hand pressing heavily on my left shoulder. Turning round in surprise, I saw the figure of my friend, GM, standing close behind me, dressed in a light-colored rough shooting suit. As I caught sight of him, he turned away and beckoned me to follow him. In the momentary glance I caught of him, I was struck by his paleness and the anxiety of his expression. I rose from my seat at once, got over the bench upon which I was sitting. The banquet was given al fresco in a large garden, and followed the figure. At the same time, the Italian agent also rose and spoke to me, asking what had happened and whether there was anyone there to whom I wished to speak. I turned back to answer his question, and when I looked again in the direction of the figure, it had vanished. Nor could I find anyone who had seen it besides myself. The sequel of the appearance may be told in a few words. Some months later, my husband received from GM's brother the announcement of our friend's death in South Africa on June 19, 1867, at an hour which, allowing for the difference of time between the locality of his decease and that in which I saw his wraith, was exactly identical with the time at which he appeared to me. I do not pretend to explain this extraordinary coincidence. The facts are precisely as I have told them, and I must leave all comment upon them to those who may read this plain, unvarnished tale. This is a kind of ghost story that shows up quite frequently in Victorian publications. Today we call it a crisis apparition, and it's exactly what we saw here. Somebody sees an apparition, it's somebody they recognize, and they find out afterwards that at the moment of seeing that person, despite being miles and miles and miles away, passed away. I don't know if they show up quite as frequently these days. I really haven't looked into it, so I might be completely wrong. But if you're interested, once again, they're called crisis apparitions. This next story is similar to a crisis apparition, but I think too much time has passed between the person's death and the appearance of the apparition for it to really qualify as a crisis apparition. In fact, it comes from an article titled "On Recognizing Apparitions Occurring More Than a Year After Death." It was written by F.W.H. Myers, and I found it in an 1889 issue of the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research. The account itself is attributed to somebody, again, identified only by initials FG, and among the ghost reports that I found, I think it's the only one that, though the account was published in England, the story itself is set in the United States. One more thing, during the time period, drummer was an informal term for traveling salesperson. So if you go drumming, you're traveling around trying to drum up some sales. In 1867, my only sister, a young lady of 18 years, died suddenly of cholera in St. Louis, Missouri. My attachment to her was very strong, and the blow a severe one to me. A year or so after her death, I became a commercial traveler, and it was in 1876, while on one of my western trips, that the event occurred. I had drummed the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and had gone to my room at the Pacific House to send in my orders, which were unusually large ones, so that I was in a very happy frame of mind indeed. My thoughts, of course, were about these orders, knowing how pleased my house would be at my success. I had not been thinking of my late sister or in any manner reflecting on the past. The hour was high noon, and the sun was shining cheerfully into my room. While busily smoking a cigar and writing out my orders, I suddenly became conscious that someone was sitting on my left, with one arm resting on the table. Quick as a flash, I turned and distinctly saw the form of my dead sister, and for a brief second or so looked her squarely in the face. So sure was I that it was she, that I sprang forward in delight, calling her by name, and as I did so, the apparition instantly vanished. Naturally, I was startled and dumbfounded, almost doubting my senses. But the cigar in my mouth and pen in hand, with the ink still moist on my letter, I satisfied myself that I had not been dreaming and was wide awake. I was near enough to touch her, had it been a physical possibility, and noted her features, expression, and details of dress, etc. She appeared as if alive. Her eyes looked kindly and perfectly natural into mine. Her skin was so lifelike that I could see the glow or moisture on its surface, and on the whole there was no change in her appearance otherwise than when alive. Now comes the most remarkable confirmation of my statement, which cannot be doubted by those who know what I state actually occurred. This visitation, or whatever you may call it, so impressed me that I took the next train home, and in the presence of my parents and others I related what had occurred. My father, a man of rare good sense and very practical, was inclined to ridicule me, as he saw how earnestly I believed what I stated. But he, too, was amazed when later on I told them of a bright red line or scratch on the right-hand side of my sister's face, which I distinctly had seen. When I mentioned this, my mother rose trembling to her feet and nearly fainted away. As soon as she sufficiently recovered her self-possession, with tears streaming down her face, she exclaimed that I had indeed seen my sister. No living mortal but herself was aware of that scratch, which she had accidentally made while doing some little act of kindness after my sister's death. She said she well remembered how pained she was to think that she should have, unintentionally, marred the features of her dead daughter, and that unknown to all, how she had carefully obliterated all traces of the slight scratch with the aid of powder, etc., and that she had never mentioned it to a human being from that day to this. In proof, neither my father nor any of our family had detected it, and positively were unaware of the incident. Yet I saw the scratch as bright as if just made. So strangely impressed was my mother that, even after she had retired to rest, she got up and dressed, came to me, and told me she knew at least that I had seen my sister. A few weeks later, my mother died, happy in her belief that she would rejoin her favorite daughter in a better world. There was nothing of a spiritual or ghostly nature in either the form or dress of my sister. She had appeared perfectly natural and dressed in clothing that she usually wore in life, which was familiar to me. From her position at the table, I could only see her from the waist up, and her appearance and everything she wore is indelibly photographed in my mind. I even had time to notice the collar and little breastpin she wore, as well as the comb in her hair after the style then worn by young ladies. The dress had no particular association for me or my mother, no more so than others she was in the habit of wearing. Today, though, while I have forgotten all her other dresses, pins, and combs, I could go to her trunk, which we have, just as she left it, and pick out the very dress and ornaments she wore when she appeared to me. So well do I remember it. I mentioned that this comes from an article written by F.W.H. Myers, and Myers follows it with a letter from F.G.'s father confirming his role in the events reported. Our next story is titled A True Ghost Story. The author is anonymous. It appeared in an 1865 issue of a magazine called The Quiver. This writer also opens up by talking about how difficult it is to find a ghost story narrated by the person who actually went through the experience. And right before telling this story, the writer says, "I will not exaggerate in the smallest degree nor relate anything which did not really occur to myself. I had gone with a party of friends in their drag to spend the day with a gentleman who had a lovely place on the borders of E Forest, and as we drove back at night I requested that I might be allowed to alight at a certain crossroad, which was the nearest point to my own house. My request was met by friendly urging to go on with the rest to the court, and there take a bed, as it was now just 12, and the road was lonely and the night dark. I answered all such kind proposals by the reply that my wife would be sure to sit up until I returned, and be very uneasy about me, that I must therefore set off. And now another plan was tried to make me change my mind. Seeing me so resolute, one of the party, a gentleman of the county, remarked that he would not take a very large sum of money to walk that road alone, and at such an hour of the night. "Why," I said, "what are you afraid of?" "What?" he replied. "Have you never heard of the ghost?" "No," I said, "never. But tell me all about it. What ghost? Where is it?" I then heard that in the time of the bloody assizes a man had been hung in chains upon a tree called Heddon Oak, underneath which my road lay, and that between 12 and 1 o'clock mysterious sounds were heard there, accompanied with the clanking of a chain. So far from this deterring me, I expressed my firm resolve to take that road that night, saying that I had long been anxious to see a ghost, and that I would gladly go where I heard one was likely to be met with. I could not help being struck by the earnest manner in which my friends tried to dissuade me, and I must confess to a little heart-sinking when, on getting down, they wished me good night and God bless you, and once more urged me to give up my resolve. However, I remained firm, and the carriage rolled away. As it did so, I entered the narrow road along which my path lay. It is what in those parts is called a lane, very narrow, with lofty hedges that almost meet on top, rising on either side. This, of course, added to the darkness, which was so great that I had to feel with my stick for the banks to avoid walking against them. Gradually the sound of the carriage wheels died away, and as I went along, looking occasionally up through the interlacing branches at the stars which here and there showed themselves, I could hear nothing but the rippling of the tiny rivulet on the other side of the hedge, and the gentle bleatings of the sheep and lambs. I felt very lonely indeed, and the thought recurred over and over again that I should have taken my friend's advice and gone on. This feeling of misgiving rather increased as I entered the wood, of which the oak formerly formed a part. But I braced myself up with all the reflection that the story after all might have no foundation, that at all events a ghost would not harm me, and that should one appear, my long-cherished wish would be gratified. Such was the current of my thoughts as I pursued my way along the road which wound round the wood, when I thought I heard the sound of a chain. I halted and listened with breathless attention, but after a minute, hearing nothing, I proceeded, selecting the turf at the side for walking on, that I might catch the faintest sound. It was not long before it came, this time not faintly, but distinctly. No single clank, but a thorough rattle, which brought me up sharp to a standstill. My first thought, for up to this time I had been on the whole rather sceptical on the subject of ghosts, was that some of my friends were in the road and making the noise. They knew the country well, having been born in it and hunted and shot over it from boyhood, and I thought it likely that, having driven on a little further, one or two of them had crossed the fields into the wood and brought with them the drag-chain, and on hearing my footsteps had rattled it for the purpose of trying my nerves and testing my courage. So I called out to two of them by name, and said that I had a couple of good stones in my hand, that I was a very good shot, and that if the noise was repeated I should fling them with my best aim to the spot from whence the sound came, and that if I hurt them or spoilt their beauty, I would not be answerable for it. This I shouted out in a stentorian voice, and scarcely had the words fallen from me when a loud and long rattle was heard about 100 yards off, and coming from the midst of the trees. Instantly I flung 6 stones in quick succession, and listened intently to hear the noise of people running away. But no, I heard plain enough the rattle of the stones through the branches, and the thud of them as they fell on the ground at the very spot whence the sound of the chain had come. After the last of them had fallen, there was awful silence. Not a branch crackled, not a leaf crisped and crunched. All was quiet, and I could distinctly hear the beatings of my own heart. I suppose it was only a few moments, but it seemed to me as if hours had passed while I thus stood, with every faculty strained to the uttermost, when again the terrible noise of a heavy chain sounded forth, and half as near to me as on the previous occasion. Now I thought of turning and running away, but shame and fear of the ridicule of my friends, who would be sure to question me on the subject, prevented me. Besides which, I was very curious to ascertain the issue, if only my nerves would not desert me, and very nigh going they were. I peered through the leafless hedge, for it was winter time. The noise was repeated so loud that the wood re-echoed with the sound. It seemed now to come from only the other side of the hedge. My spirit struggled bravely to be firm. My knees felt quite weak. The sensation of cold water trickling down my back ensued. My head felt chilly and creepy. Though the perspiration was in drops on my forehead, I felt them falling down my nose. I suppose the hairs of my head stood up, for my hat fell to the ground. I did not dare to stoop for it, but bracing myself up, I shrieked out in a highly nervous voice to the ghost, and adjured him to show himself. "Come," I cried. "If you are the ghost, let me see you. There is my hand. Touch it. Come, I want to talk with you. You will not hurt me, for I believe in ghosts. I want to hear something of the other world, of the land of spirits from whence you came. Do not keep me in this horrid suspense. I never injured you. Come and talk with me." The words had scarcely fallen from me when the loud rattle was repeated so close to me that I thought the ghost was coming to me, and I trembled all over. But I could discern nothing. I even threw my arms wildly about me, expecting to feel something. Again all was still, still as death. As I stood, I perceived a gap in the hedge a few feet further on. Going down on my hands and knees, I crept stealthily to it, with the view of looking through and trying whether I could not see the ghost at the other side. Slowly and nervously I got through the gap, holding my breath and clenching my teeth. When just as I was emerging on the other side, I saw close to me an object which staggered me. There were two big eyes from which fire gleamed. Above them stood two horns. A hot breath issued from the nostrils, heavily charged with an earthy effluvia, which on the instant I felt was sulphur. I stopped aghast at the awful sight which was so close to me. My brave resolutions were fast ebbing, my senses were departing, when the ghost came still closer, as if in answer to my challenge. Something unearthly cold touched my forehead, and I fell back screaming aloud from fright. But soon I learned that I had nothing to fear. The ghost would not harm me. My own voice was still sounding in my ears when the ghost gave utterance, and as my shriek died away in the woods, they were filled with the long-drawn "Hi, hi," with which a donkey brays. My ghost was a tethered donkey. I got up feeling heartily ashamed of myself, and that I was the greater donkey of the two. However, I reached home a wiser man, with all incredulity on the subject of ghosts thoroughly laid forever. Yeah, sometimes a ghost is a donkey. As I was collecting these 25 ghost stories, all of them purportedly true, all of them published in Victorian books and magazines, I didn't want to leave out these silly stories, the goofy stories, the ghost stories that turn out to not be ghost stories. The majority of what I have are dyed-in-the-wool ghost stories. But what I was aiming for was to capture something of the feel of what it was like to sit around a Victorian fireside on a cold winter night when people started sharing ghost stories. My hunch is this kind of funny story would probably pop up. So I didn't want to leave them out entirely. If you're interested in learning more about what I'm talking about, those 25 ghost stories, please visit a website. It's ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. My hope is that people will download copies of these ghost stories, maybe print them out, gather around a fire, maybe it's a YouTube fire, but to share ghost stories, a tradition that goes back for centuries and centuries. Once again, ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. I'm Tim Prossel. Thank you very much for listening.